we see death and life as opposing forces. That death is this external thing that comes and robs us of life. That's not accurate. You will die because you are alive, not just because you had bad luck, you got cancer, or bumped into a bus or something. Your body is programmed to do so. It is a dialectic. It's not a duality. We contain our own opposition. We contain the up and the down. It is a package deal. And so therefore it's natural. Therefore it's normal. Therefore it's even something to be celebrated, just as life is. We don't look at that as a detour or a tragedy. We look at that as sort of life. That's how it goes. What people really need was direct care, a safe place to fall apart.
Welcome to the Midlife Chrysalis podcast with Chip Conley, where we explore how midlife isn't a crisis, but a chrysalis, a time of profound transformation that can lead to the most meaningful chapter of your life.
Welcome to the Midlife Chrysalis, and today's episode is courageous, inspiring, deep. It's the kind of conversation we don't have enough. With a human, Dr. B.J. Miller, who has a life story that led to 22 million people watching his TED Talk. But it's not about, I didn't invite him on because he's, an internet sensation. I invited him on because his journey of living has been informed by his personal experience of nearly dying and his process of being bedside with the dying. This is a human who can teach us a lot about caregiving and grief, even though in his own way, he expresses some of his challenges with going deep into grief. And I express some of mine as well. So I think you'll find this to be a rich conversation, one that is particularly valuable for anybody out there who's going through a dark time or has a family member going through any kind of health issue, or anybody who's a caregiver. I hope you enjoy it. B.J. Miller, thank you for joining us on the Midlife Chrysalis.
Thanks for having me, Chip. It's really nice to be here. Thank you.
11,000 volts, 22 million views. Let's explore this as a starting point. Tell us about your tragic accident that really quite obviously changed your life, the effect of it, and the fact that, if this was the movie Sliding Door with Gwyneth Paltrow, what would B.J. Miller's life have been like if that experience had never happened?
Ooh, I almost shudder to think. I mean, because as a single event, it's hard to imagine something that's been more generative, ultimately. I mean, I want to be careful. All my comments here about my injuries, I tend to head towards the positive, but I want your listeners to, I don't want to sort of cheapen it. And for folks going through similar transitions and tough moments, lots of pain, lots of trickiness, at least came with this one. But back to your question, honestly, my life has been so beautifully, ultimately informed by that experience that it's hard to imagine where I would have gone, and it's hard to imagine liking my life anymore.
Tell us what happened.
So sophomore year, college, I was 19, sophomore. There's even an adjective, right? Sophomoric. I was being sophomoric, doing whatever, silly things. My friends and I, we had just gotten back from Thanksgiving break. And so we were excited to see each other. It had been all of 4 days or whatever. So it was a Monday night. We were doing schoolwork and stuff, but a couple of my friends and I decided to go have a beer and go out on the town for a moment. It wasn't crazy. We didn't get silly, too silly. It was relatively contained for our behavior. And we decided to go head to the Wawa market, which in New Jersey in Northeast is sort of like a 7-Eleven. So we were going to get a sandwich. And we're just walking through campus, and there's a commuter train that runs right up onto the edge of the campus. It was just parked, just sitting there, not on. It was not operating hours, or so we thought. And so, we just decided to climb it much like you'd climb a tree. It did not feel, we weren't train surfing or whatever, it didn't feel like such a big deal. There's a ladder on the back, we just jumped up on top, and I happened to be the first one up, and when I stood up, this train runs by, the power runs overhead, so that depending on where your listeners live, you may be familiar, like in San Francisco, the buses work like this. Anyway, when I stood up, I had a metal watch on, and I got close enough to the power source that the electricity arced to the watch, and, that was it. A big explosion, and, had some very extensive burns, and rushed off and on, touch and go for many weeks. Ultimately landed, ultimately, obviously survived, but lost both legs below the knees and my left arm below the elbow. But anyway, in a nutshell, that's the event itself. But of course, there are so many more storylines in there, but that's the details in some to some degree.
We're going to move on to soon enough to you having an interest in medicine, having an interest in death and dying. But what was your grief like during that time? I mean, you were a very healthy guy with a full life ahead of you. You were at Princeton, I believe. And so in some ways you were a golden boy, and all of a sudden 3 of your limbs had been severely damaged. You potentially were going to die. If you can look back, if our painful life lessons are the raw material for our future wisdom, what wisdom do you take from that experience?
It'd be hard to pick one.
Pick a few. You could pick a few.
Well, and by the way, I agree with the premise there. I do think life's harder moments are these gateways or portals or point us to what end up being the more beautiful moments too. They are related. So I totally agree with that premise. Saluted. But for me, as you said, I was in the body of something of a golden child, like you say. That's my older sister would have agreed with you that I was the favorite. Everything kind of went easy. I went to Princeton, I worked hard and all that stuff, but I from the outward appearance, you might say I had something of a silver spoon and given all of life's blessings. Freshman year, I rode crew. I was, almost 6'5", and, I had a sort of a physical body that a lot of people might shoot for. I had a brain that worked pretty well, on and on and on. And as it goes for all of us, maybe at least many of us, our experience of being in the world is shaped by our physicality and our circumstance, but doesn't always necessarily feel like our own. I spent a fair amount of my childhood feeling like I was in somebody else's life, or that maybe I was born at the wrong time. I felt I had a very common daily experience of feeling sort of out of place. I was a very sensitive kid, sort of aired melancholy. I grew up around disability, which ended up being a really helpful thing. My mom had polio and post-polio, and I was used to being around disability, and that was a huge leg up. But back to your good question, Chip, I mean, one of the first memories being in the burn unit at St. Barnabas Hospital in New Jersey, it was a nightmare in what are probably pretty obvious ways, lots of pain, et cetera, scary. And at the same time, I was experiencing so much love from my friends, from my family, from the staff, nurses, the burn techs. All this care and compassion was coming my way too. And that felt amazing to be held and loved in a certain way. Complicated, of course. You wonder if you deserve it and things like that. But that experience of feeling the compassion of others finally, which in a way I had longed for. I had felt like I'm in touch with a lot of the world's pain as a kid, but didn't get any quote unquote credit for it. You wouldn't look at me and think, "Oh, that kid struggles." So it was an isolating experience. My pain was isolating in a way, and my outward appearance sort of was misleading in a way. So now I remember the feeling or the thought being like, "Oh, now I look like I've always felt." or something like that.
Did you articulate it that at that age, or is this something you've observed over time?
Observed over time. I don't know if I would have had this language. I know I wouldn't have had this language per se, but it wouldn't have been far. I would have been a little bit more confused by my own thoughts on this than I am now. But I do remember that thought very plainly. I remember coming out of the first surgery. There were multiple surgeries. I remember the first surgery, and they just removed the legs. And I remember being wheeled out of the OR and seeing my mom, and again, she had polio, and I just remember the first thing that came to mind was say, "Oh, mom, look, now we have even more in common," you know? It was just sort of like, because I knew already that bad things happen to good people, or, that life didn't reside in our toes. And so armed with that as a young person, I feel like I got to sidestep a lot of the self-loathing that might have come my way otherwise. And I was relatively quick to see this as a point of potential connection versus dislocation or something like that.
All kinds of social science that I know you're familiar with, which shows that when you compare the happiness set point of a lottery winner versus a paraplegic after, a down or an up, depending upon the circumstances, people sort of end up back at their set point. How did this happen when you were 19, I think? And so how did how did your 20s, what was your 20s like, both in terms of the physical rehabilitation, the the sense of your identity, as well as your career path? Because really, what we're going to spend most of our time on today is the career path you've chosen, which I don't know if you would have chosen if this experience hadn't happened.
Yeah, and probably wouldn't have. Medicine was not on my radar. It's not like I always wanted to be a doctor or came from a line of doctors. That wasn't really on my radar. But I'm not sure what was really. I was very much in the liberal arts bent. I was just going to learn how to learn and be interested in life. I had that good fortune to be able to take that time. So it's not like I was heading this way and then all of a sudden I had to go that way. It's not honestly that kind of a story. So, but, another cue I got very quickly from my mom and other people who would work in the disability rights movement, sort of advocacy work. I knew a couple things, and, like, I knew not to take the bait that this all of a sudden I was special, because that's sort of one of the sweet ways that people end up exempting you from life. It's a way to kinda sweetly remove people from life often, especially around disability. That word "special" has a lot of connotations. I'll receive that comment, "Oh, that I'm special," as long as everyone else agrees that they're special too,
Yeah.
So that's sort of the deal. That time, I knew not to take that bait. That was just gonna lead me down a path of blandness. I also knew to not take the bait that this was something to overcome or put behind me. As a story, and maybe for my friends and onlookers to kind of digest and then move on, but for me, this was going to be a daily experience. And so it wasn't about overcoming it. It became about, okay, here's some raw material to work with in my life and to play with. And yes, very challenging stuff, but that kind of gets back to how my 20s went. So again, with these sort of top line thoughts, they were the organizing thoughts. And again, I just want to note for anyone out there wondering and also looking at their own experiences, this took months and years to kind of really play out and figure out. There was pounds and pounds of physical pain and emotional pain and feeling out of sorts and guilty for surviving and guilty for all the care I had received from peers, et cetera. So it's complicated, but with that caveat, back to your question, you know, as I kinda came out of that rock bottom, in a way, I've come to love rock bottoms in a way because the view, it's all up. I mean, it's just like, you're like, you can't go much lower. Of course, we always can. There was more I could lose, but, I was pretty far down there. I was on my knees, let's say, you know? And the view from there, once you kind of, transition, to accepting it or something like that, or just being real about it, that view, that vantage point. It's not a place many of us would wish to be, and myself included, but if you find yourself there, you have less to lose. And that I feel was a very, empowering notion for me. And I was also armed with now this very common appreciation for life that comes with grief. When you lose something is very often right when you really appreciate it. So yeah, I'd lost plenty, but I still had plenty. And so I was really primed to appreciate what I had and a little bit freed up to worry about comparing or contrasting myself with my peers. So in a way, it freed me to some degree, and I let it. I cultivated that freedom. So in my 20s, you would have found me, much of my 20s was spent in the San Francisco area. You would have found a very free spirit. I got into, like, looking weird. I got my hair was all over the place. I wore strange clothing. I just was like, I just looked around and I saw all this everyone trying so hard to kind of live within this very narrow range of what constituted normal. And I was given a little chance to free myself from that, and I took it. So I just kind of I was very open. Anyone wanted in my life, they're welcome to it. And it actually became a little problematic. I think I went a little too far with some of that. But you would have found a very open, free spirited person, maybe a little moody too, as I was still working out all the pain.
And you were dating, as a 20 someone in their 20s would be doing, and
Yeah,
and getting
yes,
used getting
yes.
used to dating. And career-wise, what was going on during that time?
So shortly after, I went back to college and I graduated with a degree in art history, and we can talk about that. But art that was a great move. I learned a lot about perspective making and treating life as raw material to work with, even play with. But that was awesome, but it didn't set me up for work. So graduation was sort of a cliff. I didn't really know what I was going to do. But given all that we just said, I knew I wanted to use these experiences. And so medicine lit up as a way to do that. I just thought about if a doctor walked into my room looking like me, how helpful that would have been without even a word shared, just seeing my person and knowing that I had been in the bed. And it was that kind of trust and making good on this outlandish experience that medicine seemed to offer me. So I went back and did the pre-meds after college. So that took a couple years, and then into med school. And the deal with myself, Chip, was simple. Like, I also knew that life was way too precious to be sacrificing to something that you didn't really care about. So I've made a deal with myself, medicine, if it's too hard or I just don't like it, I'll get out, but I might as well get on this horse. And by now, failure had ceased to be the worst case scenario. Failing was like, "Oh, okay, fall down, okay." It was just more about day-to-day experience, and therefore I became much more used to it. I got very good at falling.
When did you start focusing on palliative care?
Deep into med school. So all through medical school, I was at UCSF. I figured this is not so much of a love of science, but a love of humanity. And I was trying to go into medicine as a way, as an excuse to put myself in front of other people who are trying to figure themselves out. So I figured, oh, well, I should do rehab medicine, work with other folks who are freshly disabled. And that seemed the highest, best use of me. And so all through med school, I just assumed that's what I was gonna do until deep into 4th year med school, and I finally did a rotation in rehabilitation medicine. It's called physical medicine and rehabilitation is the full name of the specialty, and I did not like it. I mean, it was very mechanical. It honed my interest. I realized what I was really interested was not so much the physicality, but the emotional, spiritual, existential questions. Like, what do people do when they bump up against things they can't control? It helped me get clear on that was my issue, less about the angle of a joint or something like that. So I dropped out of the residency match and was gonna drop out of medicine. I didn't know what else I would do in it. But my dean talked me into I was, 1 semester away from graduate. I was gonna graduate. But then, my dean talked me into doing a year of residency, the internship, just as a better stopping place. You can get back into it if easier if you've done your internship. So that's what I did, and then during my internship, I stumbled on an elective in palliative care and fell immediately in love with it.
And was there an experience of being at the bedside of someone who was dying while interning that had an effect on you?
Yes, there were several experiences. So I was at the Medical College of Wisconsin for my internship. My parents at that point were living in Milwaukee. So I thought I had left home at an early age, and so I went back to be with them for that year and just do the internship, get it done. And it just so happens that the Medical College of Wisconsin has one of the oldest palliative care programs. A fellow named David Weissman did beautiful work, established sort of a pioneer in the field. And so he and his crew happened to be there. And so I got to work with a very seasoned practitioner, and just watching him at the bedside and being part of his team and how he talked to people and how he handled this event, whether it was someone dying from heart failure or whatever it was, cancer. It didn't so much matter the details of what was challenging them or taking their lives soon. It was just that they were bumping into what it means to be mortal and what it means to lose. And the way he and I came to realize the field handles we don't look at that as a detour or a tragedy. We look at that as sort of life. That's how it goes. It changes the affect at the bedside. You're no longer looking at a patient to see whether you can fix them.
It's less transactional, more transformational.
That's really well put, Chip. Exactly. It's about accompanying, that fix it mentality can be powerful when you got something that is fixable. But the way that healthcare has devoted itself, or the directions it's taken in recent decades, kind of leaves you feeling like if you're not fixable, then you're kind of in the way. There's not really, there's sort of like, and oftentimes even worse, medicine accidentally makes you feel like that's your fault. So there's a lot to say in critique of that approach. But just to say, sitting with someone, being with someone, and not trying to change who they are, rather trying to be with who they are and accompany them and see them, that was very, very powerful to me, beautiful to me. So that was a real initial hook.
And so from that point, focusing on palliative care, first of all, just so those who don't know, how do you define palliative care?
Yeah, thanks, Chip. It's a great question. Really poorly understood field. So it grew out of hospice. So hospice is sort of a subset of palliative care. It's the same training. The field is officially called hospice and palliative medicine since its inception in 2006. It's one of the newest specialties out there, but it's one of the sort of the oldest mentalities of approach to care. It's sort of ancient before we were so seduced with curing people. So it grew out of hospice in the 80s and 90s. It's a similar kind of approach to quality of life. And so a basic sort of wraparound term for palliative care might be something like multiple or multidisciplinary pursuit of quality of life and the treatment of suffering. So we treat suffering, not disease. We treat people, not disease.
So your art history gave you a little bit of a dose of understanding the human condition in life and in death. So, and what do you do with that? Like, so how do you become, what do you do with being I know at some point you ended up at I think the San Francisco Zen Center, Zen Hospice. But what was the path that you took as a doctor in working with the dying, and then, obviously later in your career, or, more recently, the last 5-10 years, you've become pretty famous about this. So what happened along the way?
We can talk for a long time. I think in general, I went the sort of well, just the sort of the mechanics of it. So I went back, finished my internal medicine residency, then did a fellowship in hospice and palliative care, the subspecialty training. And then I came back to San Francisco, joined the faculty at UCSF, and went down the path of sort of rigorous academic medicine, and trying to learn as much as I could. At that time, much of my training, as it goes in the field, especially for the medical piece of the puzzle, a lot of it was about symptom management, pain management, nausea, etc. So helping people physically feel as well as possible. And that was fine. I enjoyed that. Having spent a lot of time with pain, I know it's no fun. And so it was wonderful to be learning how to help people hurt less. But all along the way, given the reasons that you just pointed to in our conversation here, I those were talking about someone's pain or nausea was a way to gain their trust so that we could get into like the issues of identity, a word you used a bit ago is great. It's and how they're groping with the person they thought they were and the person they are now. That's the meaty stuff I couldn't wait to get to. And but all those earlier years was really about learning the trade, and so much of that about with that was about the prescription pad and the physiologic. But I think I did well as a young palliative care doctor compared to my peers because I had been a patient. I knew so much of what I was guiding people through. And I also had really wrestled with these questions around identity and grief and loss and gain and how they come together. Those are more sort of those were on the side or sort of on the margins of what we learned in our training. Those became sort of increasingly front and center for me. I'm gonna just pause there before I go on so long, and there's so much more to say about that, but does that kind of make sense? Can you picture that, Chip?
Yeah, it does. I'm curious if at any point along the way, up to you're 54 years old now, have you ever imagined going to divinity school? And I say that not that you would necessarily want to go do that and all the regimen of it, but it feels as if there's a clerical element to this. There's a science and an art and clearly a spirituality. So maybe touch on that a little bit about just what is it like to be a doctor being in service and caregiving to those at the end of their life from a more spiritual or religious perspective? Has it deepened your sense of the mystery?
Absolutely, it has. So yes, yes, yes. So as you mentioned, I stayed at UCSF all throughout my clinical work, but then I took a job at Zen Hospice Project, in part because of what you're pointing to. Yeah, the medical piece is helpful, and medicine has become sort of the arbiter of death. It's become the church, it's become the family, it's become many things. The ER is not just for medical issues. So anyway, but the sense was to as you're pointing to, that this was sort of the stuff that's really meaty here is not the stuff of medical science, and much more the stuff of spirituality, philosophy, aesthetics. So I was looking for ways to augment my understanding. So working at Zen Hospice was very helpful to work in a place with a spiritual basis of care. But again and again, I just have come back to my own experience being a patient, being a human, being someone who cares and wants to be cared for. That is the best teacher I have. It's my daily teacher, and that's been profound. And to your question, if I found myself kind of marching down a particular belief system, I most certainly would pursue training or clerical work in that, if it were Christianity, if it were whatever, Buddhism, but I never found myself lighting up with any one path. So otherwise, I think I really would, to your point. And when I was a kid trying very hard to be Christian, there was a lot I loved about the message of love and forgiveness. And at one point, I did think about pursuing the cloth. Anyway, back to my later experiences. Yes, I felt very much pulled in the spiritual direction, but not in an organized way, more in a daily life kind of way.
If you're enjoying the conversations we've been having on the Midlife Chrysalis, I have a valuable offer for you to consider. My book, Learning to Love Midlife, 12 Reasons Why Life Gets Better with Age, is a national bestseller. And right now, you can get a copy for just the cost of shipping. It offers stories, research, and practices to help you move from a midlife crisis to a midlife catalyst and see this stage of life not as a decline, but an opportunity to flourish. Claim your copy today at meawisdom.com/midlife book. What do we get wrong about death in the United States? Let me count the ways.
Well, yeah, it's a long list. I mean, one is, I think, all trouble at root. I think the biggest problem is that we've tried to wrestle dying away from living, that we see death and life as opposing forces, that death is this external thing that comes and robs us of life. That's all our language, the sort of succumbing to illness, or this sort of it's all the sort of language of giving up or giving into this thing that robs us of our life. It's inherently tragic. That's not accurate. And you just need to spend a little time with yourself, really paying attention to the world at all to see how, or just better yet, walk in the woods. That if we're parts of nature, there is no separating life and death in nature. They are one and the same. They are part and parcel. So back to your question, I think that is the fundamental error that we make, and all the rest of it is sort of fallout from that mis- misplaced notion that we can forestall death, keep it at bay. I think a really stop here a second. I think a really important note, though, and I find myself thinking about it a lot for myself and the people I care for, which is you will die because you are alive, not just because you had bad luck, you got cancer, or bumped into a bus or something. If you have if you're in bubble wrap, you will still die. Your body is programmed to do so. It is a dialectic, it's not a duality. We contain our own opposition. We contain the up and the down. It is a package deal, and so therefore, it's natural, therefore, it's normal, therefore, it's even something to be celebrated just as life is. So, older cultures have gotten this, go to Varanasi in India,
I've been
a
there.
lot of the cultures have been around the planet for a little bit longer than the US per se, have gotten this memo, and you can feel it.
You were an advisor to a president of the United States, and you could have one wish about a public policy or change in the culture regarding caregiving and or death, and you're welcome to have more than one wish. What would that be?
Well, let's see here, that's a fun one. Excuse me. Let's start with healthcare because it's still too huge to ignore, and it has such potential. I'm alive because of modern medicine. It can be so beautiful, but our systems have really gummed it up. The man-made stuff, the constructs, the policies, etc. So I would take healthcare down to its studs and reimagine it as inherently palliative in nature. It's more like all healthcare should be palliative care. By that, we mean, do I care about your quality of life? Do I care how this illness or this event is affecting you and your family? Of course I do. It's just putting care in the sort of groundwork of the healthcare. So all healthcare would be trained in palliative care, and then on top of that, you'd add these beautiful ways to forestall illness or treat illness or suffer less. But it would all be in the name of supporting the human condition as natural beings. So that would be one. I think we'd have a very different country if that were the case within a generation.
We probably appreciate midlife more. I think there are many reasons why midlife is not appreciated in the US and called the midlife crisis, but one of the many reasons is because it's the doorway to the second half of your life and the fact that you're going to die. And people just don't want to think about that.
Right. Which is don't want to think about it. So it's sort of same way saying like they don't want to think about their life. They don't want to think about life. Like this is where the problem of separating these things. So and then you find yourself at odds with reality, and boy, there's your grand ticket to suffering right there. So, right, I'm completely with you, Chip. That's really well said. So, there's a beat as to what else we might change. Well, I would love to talk to the culture makers in the world and find ways to get real about aging as well as sort of celebrate it, usher in aging in a different way, which I know means a lot for you, which is your work too. So that could be up to the culture makers to some degree. From a policy point of view, we gotta crack the code on how do we support caregiving in this country, period. So I think those are my top 3 moves that would change the country, I think, pretty quickly.
Tell us about Mettle Health, spelled Mettle, because in many ways you're creating a role model for a company dedicated to caregiving. And in So explain what it is. You're now an entrepreneur, my friend. Who knew? Who knew?
I know, it's not nuts. I mean, this is the playful thing with identity. Once you get to know that you're not your job, you're not any one thing, it's can be a little devastating, but also frees you up to kind of play with it. So yeah, I've been a doctor, I've been a patient, I've been an author, I'm a speaker, now I'm an entrepreneur. What who knows what else is going to come? But anyway, yeah, back to your good question. So metal. So my business partner Sonia Dolan and I, we had been working together for a few years. Worked on a lot of the sort of public engagement, trying to talk to people, get folks paying attention, just like you're doing here, to the realities of life. We were heading down a different path. We were going to start a library of resources to help people not fall into the rabbit holes of Googling their diagnosis and help information flow a little bit differently. But then the pandemic hit. And so Sonia and I decided that what people really needed was direct care. They needed a safe place, phrase that we've come to love. It's a safe place to fall apart, essentially, with this big existential crisis. So, and that allowed me to devote a practice to the things that I knew I cared about most. I got to let go of the prescription pad. We pulled metal out of the medical model. So I'm no longer practicing medicine technically. And in this practice, we could focus entirely on the existential, spiritual, social nature of all this stuff. So it allowed me to put my chip down on the things that I had knew were my prime loves, but I was doing these other things, symptom management, other things, just to get to that other stuff. So anyway, we started Mettle Health early in the pandemic, 2020. Hung our shingle, and at that time, telehealth was on the rise too. So we just started zooming with people 1 hour at a time, just talk to anyone just about anything, and it allowed us also to welcome caregivers into the equation. You didn't have to be a patient, so therefore you can be anything and talk to us. And so off we went. And so that's how Mettle Health got started.
And so it is a consulting service or a retainer. People really look to you to provide the combination of medical, spiritual, psychological help at a later stage of life.
Really, any stage of life, because a good question is when you start dying. And it's not about death so much. It's about as much as it is about transitions. I know a catchment you play with too. It's really the details of how old you are or whether you're dying or losing something. It's become less important. It's just like life ain't what you thought it was. You're now scared or freaked out or lost, and you got to go. You need somewhere to turn, someone to talk to. So it is all those things. We do help people navigate healthcare. All our counselors are former clinicians, so we know healthcare. We can help you navigate healthcare. We can help you reconfigure your identity. We can help you fall apart and then help put you back together again just by being an honest, reflective device with you. So it goes many directions. And I would say maybe 60% of our clients are caregivers or family members. They're not the ones who are technically dealing with the illness themselves. So, and then a subset is still of folks who are going through an existential crisis. They're struggling to find meaning in their life, but there's no tragedies befallen. They're just kind of languishing. And then another even smaller subset are clinicians themselves who are oftentimes calling us because they're burned out or need help with a patient of theirs, et cetera. So we see an array of things, of people.
What are your prescriptive tips for caregivers? I mean, what can you words of wisdom do you have for people who have been forced into the caregiving profession because of family or friends, as opposed to doing people who are doing it as profession?
Yeah, and I think the advice actually ends up being much the same for depending no matter what landed you in a caregiving role, personal, professional, whether you sought it or it befell you or it's duty driving you or obligation or you're just stuck. I think, I think a root notion, much like, reacquainting living and dying. I think we're trying to reacquaint sort of self and other. And the healthcare, as I was trained, and the world I grew up in, caring for my mom, et cetera, the messaging sort of suggested that you want to be a good caregiver, then you need to minimize your own needs. You need to shrink yourself so you can grow for another over here. And that's sort of the math that is, and that it is a selfless act, this kind of stuff. I mean, you see, everyone gets to see it how whatever feels right. But I think that way I got to see it in its sort of to a sort of logical, tragic conclusion in healthcare where everyone's burning out. I mean, you don't sleep, you don't eat, you're not supposed to have any you become a machine of output, of care as an output. And that is really importantly wrong. This gets at sort of self-care for caregiving. But even the phrase self-care is problematic. It implies that, that self and other are somehow so different that you have to note that it's important to take care of yourself in order to care for another. It is that's sort of a conceit. Because of this sort of one-way notion of caregiving, we suffer in this way. What I saw play out in among some individuals who got there however they did, and what I saw play out in more into the sort of Buddhism tenets of care, was that care was much better conceived of as a loop, this circle of care that let's just say you're my patient, Chip. Well, okay, I will care for you. I will care, but I'm really caring with you. I'm jumping in, I'm sitting next to you, not above you, human to human. And trying to see how we can kind of make something a little less hard together. And so I'm partnering with you. I'm not caring at you. And in so doing, I get to be accompanied too in my humanity. I get to receive your attention. And this sort of caregiving when it's going well is really as much care receiving as it is giving. It's really a loop of reciprocity. That's when it works really well. Now, as I say that, I just real quick, I know I'm saying a lot of words here, Chip, but let me just say, I know that might sound to any caregivers out there listening to it might sound, well, that sounds great. But you know what? I've got 8 zillion to do things to get mom to the appointment or whatever it is. And yeah, how the hell am I going to take care of myself in all this mix? And I get it. It's sometimes feels impossible, but much of the impossibility is really because of the world we've created around caregiving. We don't support it. You are not encouraged to take care of yourself. You're supposed to somehow find this time and not sacrifice work, not sacrifice your own family's needs, etcetera. It's an impossible setup. Caring is not impossible. Caregiving in modern life has started to feel impossible, but that is an invented thing. That's a made up situation.
I guess it is. We've had caregiving since the start of time. So, what advice and wisdom do you have around grief?
Oh, just that I've become such a fan of it. I've just been really, and it took me a while, I didn't really let myself grieve in a thoughtful way when I lost my limbs. I lost my sister some years later. I didn't really let myself grieve there, not consciously. I kind of bought into grief was the kind of that was a route to sort of sad sack and something weak or something not good, not valuable. I have to admit that it was deep into my 30s before I really started letting myself see otherwise. And it was my patients who were teaching me this. Even though I'd had good reason to grieve, I just really hadn't taken it up. I hadn't, and I was suffering because of it. I was at odds with parts of my experience. Like, my sister died. Because I was unwilling to consciously grieve or lean into my grief. I walled her off. I couldn't even summon my memory of her. So I just kept losing more.
And
So I
did you do
finally
this,
eventually
BJ? Did you do the same for your own injuries? I mean, did you ever have a chance to grieve back then, or has it been something that you have ever been able to truly
no,
know?
no. I've revisited it. I have, grief, is mysterious and, odd and just makes me f makes a person feel weird. It's a wild force, and I think that's a really good phrase for it, a wild force. It is nature. It is a natural force. But no, I did not give myself a period of mourning back then. I kind of held myself hostage. I kept kind of leveraging that pain and trying to kind of ram myself back into the world. And to some degree, I did, it worked okay, but I just kept forestalling this grief that I finally started come to terms with later in my 30s and 40s and still do now. I'm often impressed at how much more grieving I have to do just to catch up with the life I've led so far.
So the title of this podcast is The Midlife Chrysalis, suggesting there's a caterpillar, a cocoon that can be dark and gooey, a transition point, and then, if we're lucky, a butterfly. Have you gone through a midlife chrysalis in the last 5 or 10 years in the core of your midlife? What has it been, and what are you learning from it? And has there been some grief along the way?
Very much so. You're putting your finger, I mean, it is, yes. Yes, and it's not many of my big losses, the dramatic ones, were earlier, my sister's death, my limbs, etcetera. And more recently, the losses are, loss of a friendship. 12 years ago, the loss of a marriage, the loss of a sense of myself, the loss of feeling competent sometimes, the loss of feeling like I lived in a country that was coherent, all sorts of losses. And, loss is funny. Loss, we don't, I don't think it pays to weigh your loss or compare your loss. Like I had some very dramatic losses at a young age, but they're not more impressive or more important than, I don't know, losing a friendship. It doesn't pay to compare them. Loss in some level, in some fundamental way, I think, loss is loss is loss. So it took deep into really in my 40s and more recently that I'm really letting myself access those hard feelings. I went right to I knew I needed to accept my limb loss. I just kind of beeline to acceptance. I didn't let myself miss anything. And so so I kept doing that. And by the time I got to be 40s and 50, I realized I could no longer cry, which was a real tell. I couldn't get to tears. That was a big tell. I felt often kind of numbed out and just sort of bland. I was not able to access the peaks of joy and things like that as I had once experienced, and I couldn't access sort of depths of sorrow, and that was a really important tell. I started to feel like I was really missing out on something in my own experience, and it was through working with patients and watching people and accept and roll with their grief that I realized that's what I had been missing. The grieving process, letting myself feel those hard feelings was exactly the missing ingredient. And so in recent years, it's been much about letting myself feel any hard feeling whenever it comes, almost loving it. Actually, definitely loving it and letting myself feel it. I can almost cry in movies. I can almost cry when I lost my dog last year. I get real close. I'm much closer to tears than I was 5 years ago.
So you and I are so similar. Tears are hard for me. And I have found that when I watch a movie on an airplane, I lose it. And yeah, some movies, when the underdog wins the sports event, that does it. But it is a very, there's a little bit of a fear. Like if I really go there, will I ever stop crying?
I was just gonna say that, Chip, and I'm pretty sure that the answer is yes, we'll stop crying. I've watched some people do it, but I harbor some old piece of me harbors that same feeling that I can't look at that stuff, then I'll only be that stuff and then I'm gone. I don't think that's true, but I've
Well, I
harbored
think
those
a
fears.
lot of men have this issue.
Yep,
So
probably true.
Bronnie Ware famously wrote a book about the 5 regrets of the dying. She talked about the courage to live an authentic. These are the 5 regrets. So there's a regret that they didn't live the courage to live the authentic life, and they were living up to other people's expectations. They have a regret that they worked too hard. They have a regret that they didn't really get to express their feelings, a regret that they didn't stay in touch with some friends, and a regret that they didn't let themselves be happier. How do you feel about those 5? And from your perspective, from your observation of seeing people at the end of their life, Frank Ostaseski, who you know well, who started, I think he started the Zen Hospice. He once said to me when I was going through, I'd had a flatline experience and he was having some serious health challenges. He said, one of the things that people are wondering at the end of their life is, was I well loved and did I love well? What do you see at the end of a person's life in terms of how they're doing the life accounting of how it all shaped up?
Those 5 that you listed and Frank's comment to you all light up for me as accurate. And, so I have nothing to say that would conflict there, but I just share with you that the way I think about it or feel about it, it's a little bit more distilled around honesty. Like, it's like I would I this is and maybe if we talk again in a couple years, I may be off this word. This may be my own developmental arc so I'm seeing everything through this lens, but I would have sworn I was an honest person anytime you and I would have talked anytime along across my life. Not in some, like, I'm so cool way. I just pretty honest. When I'd lie, I'd feel terrible about it, and I'd usually fess up, whatever. So and as I've gotten deeper into life and like this note about trying to forestall grief and the hard stuff, trying to engineer sort of more good, less bad, all that has gone into that effort, that quixotic effort, has meant me kind of engineering I squint at just the right moment and open my eyes wide at just the right to kind of curate what's coming into my experience. And it's just exhausting and futile, and it just kept me at bay from a lot it's too much of life. So, back to what I'm saying here is, like, what I see play out at the deathbed for a lot of people really comes down to their capacity to be really honest with themselves, like, really honest with themselves, not just to not tell a lie, but a deep set honesty about our fears, about how we feel about anything. That's even if, like, assuming we can even access the feelings to be honest about it. But I think most of us in this country or in this life, in this hemisphere, perhaps these days, have undergone so much engineering around trying to look a certain way, feel a certain way at the expense of the rest of life. That I think I have to believe a lot of us are in some a boat like this. And I do see that play out with clients that I've worked with is, can they really get real, really all the way real with themselves in the world? And I don't see that often that people do. I think there's a fair amount of work left for most of us at the end.
So there's a movie that's recently come out called The Last Ecstatic Days. I don't know if you've seen it. It's about a guy. Yeah, it's a guy in his late 30s who has brain cancer, glioblastoma. Is that what it's called?
Oh, glioblastoma? Yeah.
Glioblastoma, very severe form of brain cancer, very accelerated. And they film his final days, his final weeks. And, it's like dying as a creative act. I think that's maybe a term that you've used before even. Will you tell us a little bit about what that means? Dying as a creative act. By the way, for those who are looking to come to an MEA workshop, that film will be one of the 58 films in our MEA Film Fest in December in Santa Fe.
Beautiful. Well, dying is a creative act, just like living is a creative act. Again, living and dying, much the same thing. And I do think of, and that was another nod to studying art and art history as a way, as a lens to see human endeavoring. What I mean by that, dying as a creative act, is we get to play with the material of our life if we so choose. We get to play with our identity and not get stuck or too fixed. Everything is in motion. Even stone is in motion at just different times. So given that everything's in motion, it really starts becoming about becoming. We're never fixed, so we're always in motion. So what are we? Well, we are becoming. I'm moving from this to that. It's just sort of the truth or the math of time and space coordination. So if I'm always becoming, well, then I get some agency in how I steer and which thoughts I pick up and which feelings I roll with. And that is a creative process of working with the material of your life, including your dying. It's, unfortunately, we kinda hold dying as this like, your life was before the dying process, and then you're sort of just in the way and kinda let's usher you out of here, with this that's unfortunately a lot of sort of the overlay of how we think of value in human life. If you matter because you exist, not because you accomplished this or that thing, but if you matter because you exist, which I believe is true, then and that's how I choose to see being, and if life was given to us, but I think one of the kindest ways to honor that gift is to be affected by the rest of life, to break down barriers between myself and others, to see these connections, to see how we affect each other, to be affected. I mean, I think it was the most loving things I think we can do is to be affected by each other. And that too kind of flies in the face with a lot of notions, especially of manhood. So anyway, back to your question. I mean, I think these are all the sort of the material bits of this overlay of seeing dying just like the rest of living as a creative act. It's yours to play with, to work with. And if you so choose, that's a really good way to take yourself out to your final breath and really be alive until you're actually dead.
So, BJ, one of the questions we end with is you've built some wisdom along the way. MEA is a midlife wisdom school, and in 2026, you're going to be actually leading a workshop on caregiving and grief. And a lot of what we've talked about today, we're very honored to have you join us in Santa Fe. If you were to distill down the wisdom that you've learned onto a bumper sticker that really has your wisdom fingerprints on it, what would be that bumper sticker, and what might be the origin story? We probably maybe already talked about the origin story, so you don't have to repeat something. But at 54 years old, which is the average age of the person who comes to MEA, what would be your wisdom bumper sticker?
Hmm. Ooh, wow, there's a few that notions that come to mind. I mean, can I share a couple?
Yeah, perfectly fine.
One is answer I gave to a similar question once was, "Don't believe everything you think," and I've seen that bumper sticker. So that's a bumper sticker that exists in the world, and that one works pretty well. Don't believe everything you think. In other words, don't confuse yourself with your thoughts or any other one component of who you are. I think that's a pretty damn good one. That's pretty rich. That is a lot can flow from that. Related is a phrase that I've liked. I can't remember the prompt that got me to this one, but we are the phrase is, "We are freer than we think." And that sort of kind of again points to mind and the thinking mind as this as the cage much more than anything else. And also sort of gets to I think especially in this country, we talk a lot about loving our freedom, but there's a lot of responsibility that goes with that freedom. And so, there's many reasons we don't choose freedom. So anyway, we are freer than we think. I think you could chew on that for a couple lifetimes. One more kind of comes to mind is if in terms of a prescription for me, that's that's really been personal and one I would like to see increasingly part of how I organize the rest of my life, which is basically follow beauty. I think beauty is just yeah, it's just so awesome. And how do we define beauty? I don't mean pretty, I mean something true.
You
I
mean
mean, like,
awe, you mean Dacher Keltner, you mean
yes,
like the idea that in awe is joy, in awe is wisdom, in awe is life.
yes. And awe is right-sizing ourselves too. Like, I am this teeny little thing, but I'm part of this huge thing. I'm not separable from it. It's not about me, and it's not about me. There's a little paradox for you, and between those 2 is somehow the truth. But I see beauty as, like, the truth incarnate. That's sort of a philosophical definition. So that's what I want.
You are still an art history major, my friend. You still taking it all the way back to the start of this conversation. It comes back to beauty. So thank you very much. You're a role model in so many ways. And thank you. I just wanted to say you're an inspiration, and your humility. including how you conducted this interview, just is a treasure. So you are a moral beauty.
Thank you, Chip. Those are words I will aspire to, and I really appreciate being with you, buddy. It's such a joy talking to you about this stuff, and I can't wait to see you in Santa Fe next spring or summer, whenever we do it.
Yep,
Yeah.
exactly. Oh, that was probably one of my favorite episodes. I After we finished the recording, I said to BJ, and he agreed. We could have talked for 3 hours. What an interesting cap. I hope many of you will sign up for his weekend workshop in Santa Fe next year. Gosh, to distill it down to just 3 key bullet points is hard. I would just maybe start with the idea that he has a comfort with failure. When you have come face to face with death and when you've lost 3 limbs, your ability to pick yourself up and realize that failure is, you can have small failures and big failures throughout your life and you're still alive, is huge. You have less to lose, as he says, and you appreciate every single day of life. I'd say that's one of the key lessons. A second lesson would be this idea of the circle of care, the reciprocity of this loop, that if you're a caregiver, you're not caring for someone else, you're caring with someone else. Now, that is so hard to hear when you're in the midst of a lack of sleep, when you're having a hard time holding down your job because you're taking care of someone else, when society is not very good and the government is not very good of taking care of the caregivers. But figuring out that reciprocity, figuring out the reciprocity, not just with you and the individual you're caring for, but the community, if there can be a community that helps support you in that process. And then I think thirdly, I awakened to the fact that this is a guy who still in his life has not maybe fully opened the door to all the grief of what happened to him at age 19. And many of us have that experience, whether it's something from childhood, a violation of something as a kid, a painful life lesson that hasn't been fully healed. BJ has been a wounded healer, healing other people and being at the bedside when there's lots of tears and lots of grief. But like me, as somebody where I've shared tears with others, it's usually their tears and my consoling. There are times I do cry, but I still have a message in my head that says, big boys don't cry. So that is that for both BJ and for me, I think that is one of the things that we want to actually get better at as we get older. Hopefully we are getting better at being human our whole lives and being able to really surrender to grief and to the effect grief can have on our bodies and our emotions and the healing process that can come from that. I think that's the third lesson I had from BJ. So I hope you enjoyed this. Share this with a friend. This is a particularly good episode to share with someone that you know who's going through some caregiving challenges or is in their own midlife chrysalis. Maybe they're going through their own, illness, cancer or the like. Hope you enjoyed it and that it was instructive and inspiring. See you next week.
Thanks for listening to the Midlife Chrysalis. This show is produced by Midlife Media. If you enjoyed this episode, help us spread the word by subscribing and leaving a review on your favorite platform.